So, with the announcement that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is getting the anime treatment for Netflix probably later this year, and that the entire cast from the movie is reprising their roles, every single member it looks like is coming back to voice the same character as they did in the movie, I thought it'd be a great time to talk about Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the movie that came out in 2010, because it is my favourite movie of all time. I'm not kidding you. It has been since about 2013, and it continues to be to this day. So, for those of you who don't know, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a movie directed by Edgar Wright, who you probably know best for his Cornetto trilogy with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, The World's End, as well as working on Spaced and Baby Driver, and most recently Last Night in Soho. Over the years, he's worked his way up to becoming one of the most creative directors of all time. This movie, however, I think is the worst of his in terms of box office appeal. When it first came out in 2010, it kind of flew under the radar and nobody went to see it. But in recent years, and after it came out on DVD and Blu-ray coincidentally, it gained a bit of a cult following, and now it's sort of blown up into this massive thing, enough for Netflix to pick it up for an anime adaptation so many years later. Looking back on when this movie came out from a 2023 perspective, if this movie came out nowadays, despite the fact that the plot is not going to be for everyone, some people are and have been turned off by sort of how bombastic and out there this movie is. If this movie came out now, I feel like it would have done a lot better. Not only because people are more familiar with Edgar Wright and his work, and he's more of an appreciated director. I mean, he was appreciated back then for Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, but now he's sort of spanned his movie making universe into making some of the best movies that come out within the year that one of his movies drops. But looking at the cast list of this thing, people who weren't necessarily massive names back in 2010 are massive names now. I mean, Michael Cera was known for Arrested Development. Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I think, had a couple of movies under her belt. Anna Kendrick's in this movie briefly, so is Aubrey Plaza from Parks and Rec. We've also got Chris Evans and Brie Larson as well, Marvel fame. So looking at the cast list of this movie, it's just a great ensemble cast to look back at and go, this is kind of when these guys were relatively unknown, and it's great to see how successful a lot of the people in this movie became after this movie's release. And I guess I better break the plot down slightly, because I guarantee there's at least going to be some people who watch this video who have no clue what the movie's about. Basically, to put it in a way that makes it sound slightly less boring than the movie actually is, Scott Pilgrim is an average 22 kind of year old guy who is currently dating a 17-year-old Chinese girl, trying to get over a breakup, but that's not revealed really until later on in the movie. But he meets this other girl played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead called Ramona Flowers, who you may have heard that name thrown about. It's sort of been thrown about. This movie's quite big in the indie scene, so you've probably heard that being thrown about by people at your school or just on social media. And he basically falls for her, and they start hooking up and dating, and essentially she reveals that she has 7 evil exes that Scott has to fight in order to basically date her happily. Very kind of out there plot, and by fight I don't mean sort of violent fist fight. I mean people throwing fireballs as floating demon hipster chicks. There's Chris Evans, and who's an actor in this movie as well, and his stunt team using skateboards to beat Scott up. And there's cracks and pals and people being thrown into buildings. It's basically a comic book slash video game come to life, and it is magnificent from start to finish. It's also one of the funniest movies I've ever seen in my life, and I'm not exaggerating. Just how quirky and nerdy some of the jokes are just hit me right in the nerd core. I'll keep it semi-vague just in case my description of the movie makes you want to watch it, but some of the funniest scenes, the most creatively funny scenes in the movie I've ever seen appear in this movie. There's one involving a superpowered individual that Scott's fighting who's a vegan, and how he eventually defeats him. I'm not going to spoil, but that scene is absolutely hilarious. There's also a scene slightly before that with someone who has highlights in their hair getting punched so hard that the highlights literally explode from their hair. Just It's really out there, man. But if you haven't seen it, you really need to, because not only is it a well-crafted, funny action movie, it also has a decent amount of heart to it. And if you've seen this movie as many times as I have, I watch it pretty much every year, at least once. It's one of those movies for me. You slowly start to realize that no one in this movie is truly that likable, which is strange because I find it a comfort movie and really endearing. But a lot of the characters in this movie are not only egotistical, they're selfish. Scott Pilgrim, for example, the main character of this whole movie, is 22 dating a 17-year-old at the beginning, which is just kind of weird in its own right and slightly illegal depending on where you live. And then he also meets this other girl and then basically cheats on his girlfriend, and he's always thinking about himself and moping around. So it's almost like a character journey for him to learn how to sort of respect the people around him and also respect himself as well. Ramona's just a destructive character. You learn a little bit about her backstory, why these exes are sort of, there, and why they're angry with her and why they're sort of in this situation. Scott's bandmates, I suppose they're probably the most normal, down-to-earth people in this movie. They just kind of hang out and crack jokes with each other, but you've got all the superpowered exes as well who are egotistical. Chris Evans' character is an actor who really is up himself. Brie Larson's character as well is pretty much egotistical as well, and her boyfriend, who is the vegan in this movie, is just completely dumb, but hilarious to watch. It's just a lot of the characters aren't very likable, but yet you still gravitate towards them. It takes some real skill to pull that off in a movie. You may not think that that takes much skill, but hopefully this next point with another movie I'm going to bring up helps you see the way I do. Think about Joker by Todd Phillips. Joaquin Phoenix's performance in that movie is great. I really like the movie in general. Saw it twice in the cinema. But think about that movie and sort of how it made you sympathize with the Joker, who's typically a maniacal, sadistic, murdering clown machine. And it brought it down to earth a little bit. Not to the point where you necessarily agree with what he's doing, because he is going out and committing, shootings and crimes and stuff like that in the movie. But you sympathize with him in a way where you understand why he takes the actions that he does. Whether you agree with him or not, you could see why a person like him would go to those extremes. And you somehow make a character like the Joker semi-likable and relatable in a couple of those scenes. In this movie, you somehow relate to characters that are demonstrating nothing but egocentric and selfish attitudes for the entire thing, because they're amusing to watch. I don't know if that necessarily came together as well as I maybe hoped it did, but in my head it sort of makes sense, those two parallels. So it's a difficult thing to do, not only for you to almost relate to these unlikable characters, but in the sense of the Joker, how he's usually a complete monstrous villain, and somebody was able to still make him relatable. It's the same sort of thing as Edgar Wright's done with these characters, even though they're not criminals as such. Although Scott, we'll ignore the 17-year-old thing for the moment because I brought that up a couple of times now. But for the most part, the people in this movie aren't really criminals. They're just not very likable people. I'd like to stress as well that with the fight scenes taking on a more comic booky video game type feel, the way that they're choreographed and the way that they're shot, you can tell everything that's happening. It's just, this movie is executed and filmed so incredibly well, and the cast does such a great job that it genuinely almost upsets me in a way that not many people went to see it when it first came out. I'm glad that it got the appreciation it rightfully deserves now in modern day society. I mean, it did a few years ago, but critics, I think for the most part, were favourable towards the movie when it came out. But again, nobody went to see it. I'm just glad that it's in a position now where the cast obviously had a great time making the initial movie to begin with. Many people saw the movie, like me, and went back to read the source material as well after the fact, and it's become this whole thing. It's not necessarily really that much of an indie property anymore. It's one that you could just run into somebody on the street and they might know what Scott Pilgrim is. It's one of those things. It's just a comforting movie for me. It's the movie I watch pretty much every Valentine's Day. I don't mind admitting that. Usually, I spend that day alone. It's just a movie that makes me feel alright. You know, I have comfort movies. I think everybody does. There's this for me and 21 Jump Street as well. I've seen that movie about probably about 30 times. If I'm being completely honest, probably about 30 times since 2012. I've seen that movie. This movie I've seen probably a few more times than that. But this wasn't really meant to be an in-depth sort of analysis of every scene of the movie. It's just me talking about my thoughts and telling people, I guess, how much this movie means to me and how much I love it. And I thought that maybe I would do this series thing where when we're in a slow week and not a lot's come out that's worth talking about, I could talk about my favourite movies, because a lot of them are movies that a lot of you probably have seen and loved too. I mean, I'm really tempted right after this to film a video about Taxi Driver, but we'll see how that goes, because that is another phenomenal movie. But tell me about your experience with this movie. Have you seen it? If you don't like it, I desperately want to know why. Maybe it's too quirky for you. I guess I want to get into the discussion. I want more people talking about this movie, especially now that we're getting an anime adaptation as well. And I'm not even a big anime guy. Like, I don't even typically like anime, but because all the same cast members are going to be in it, I am excited. This movie is one of the only movies to me that would get like a high 9, close to a 10. It's not a perfect movie by any stretch of the imagination, you know. You could probably pick a few holes in any movie you watch, but for me, for pure enjoyment and how I feel about it, no movie has done the same for me. So, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, because it really helps out a lot. And I will see you guys in the next video, whatever I happen to be talking about, which might be the Super Mario movie. Maybe not. I'm still deciding whether or not I actually want to go watch that. But it could be a review of that. See you next time.